This episode is brought to you by our good friends over at Qoitech. They empower engineering teams to build energy-efficient IoT and embedded devices. They provide state-of-the-art solutions for power consumption measurements and analysis and battery life prediction. Power profile your hardware and software and test and pick the right battery or energy harvesting for your application at your bench or in an automated setting, all with the one comprehensive, flexible, and scalable IoT product suite. Join the leading players in the electronics industry in delivering long-lasting innovation with Qoitech. Learn more at Qoitech.com. That's Qoitech.com. Welcome back to the IoT for All podcast, Nick. Thanks for being here.
Good to see you again, Ryan. I think this is our second time, a twofer.
Yes. Very excited to have you back. Lots of good things that we know we want to discuss. But for audience who may be unfamiliar, can you give a quick introduction about yourself and the company?
Nick Earle, CEO of Eseye, Eseye. We're an MVNO based out of the UK, but with customers globally. We've got several million devices under connection, and we do IoT for companies like Amazon, Shell, Coca-Cola. We have several hundred customers, but our sweet spot is large global IoT deployments.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about, because I think you'll have a very interesting perspective on this, not just the position you play in the market, but also the fact that you recently did a State of IoT Adoption report, which is a very interesting topic, just thinking about adoption in IoT, right? Lots of things have changed over the last number of years. Can you tell us why you all worked on that report, what the purpose of it was, just a high level, and then we'll dive into the details?
Great question. It gets right to the heart of the nub of what I think we're going to be talking about. There's a lot of myths around IoT out there, and a lot of the research that's previously been done, we felt was asking the wrong question. Because there've been a lot of predictions that says, I remember we were going to do 50 million connections, 50 billion connections by 2020. And here we are now in 2024, and maybe we're at 14 or something. I mean, we've missed every projection we've ever made in IoT. I mean, this is a badge of shame for the industry, and
but we love the optimism, though, right? Over the years,
each year we say this is the year it's going to be different. This is the year it's going to take off. Just wait and see, and then let's do the survey again next year. So what we said was, look, maybe we're asking the wrong question. So what we did was, we did what we think is the largest survey ever been done on IoT of people who have tried to implement IoT. And we said, so we got 1,200 customers, typically US, UK, and people, decision makers in medium to large companies who had done an IoT project, which most people don't specifically look at those. And we said to them, in retrospect, when you look back, what were the biggest issues that you had? Why did you not achieve what you were after? So actually, two big findings jumped out. The first one, which was, oh my God, I can't believe we are collectively that bad, was, and you have to kind of read the report. By the way, it's a huge report on our website, but let me just give you the net takeaway. And I had to read it 3 times before I believed it. Less than 1%, and if we were generous, we call it 2%. But let's say less than 2% of people said that across their entire estate, they were getting 98% connectivity. Now, if you think about that, let's say you're doing a medical device, a heart monitor, or something in a care home, or something absolutely mission critical. What other part of IT would you accept? In 2% of the time, there'll be no data. But that is actually the norm. And but the second question that pops out is, and so now that you've tried and failed, what do you put it down to? Because everyone says we can do it. There's over 800 mobile network operators out there. What's the problem? And they say that over 50%, about 55, 56% say, well, I had no idea how difficult the device was. I am not a firmware expert. And every time I had a problem, it was, it's not the connectivity. It's not the SIM. It's actually your firmware. And nobody told me I had to be a hardware design guy to get IoT connectivity. So, we can talk about how those things get solved and how we've solved them for these large customers I quoted. But the fact is that we first of all need to start off by holding a mirror up to ourselves and saying our report card on this is like, as an industry, is like a D-. That cannot last, because the reason we didn't hit the 50 billion is because the large companies who really want to do global single SKU product rollout, don't want to have to put a proprietary SIM in country by country by country because their economic model for the ROI case it just goes out the window. And so we've got to solve ubiquitous global IoT, otherwise these statistics will continue to be terrible.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, we've had so many discussions on here, I feel like, around how far connectivity has come. Trying to solve that exact problem is how do you increase the availability of connectivity so that solutions have connectivity at all time? But it still seems to be quite a challenge.
Again, I go back to there's a lot of really smart people in IoT. There's a lot of money in IoT. There's a lot of big companies. I mean, the combined turnover of the mobile network operators that I talked about is over $1 trillion. It's not like there's not a lot of brain power and resources being thrown at this problem. But let me give you our view as SI. And of course, other solutions are available. But our view as SI, how are we delivering 100% connectivity globally to Amazon? Which is a case study that we've done and published, and I've done a podcast with Amazon on that, them talking about that. What we did, and our founders did actually, our founders were device guys, and they came out of, they were actually the creators of Zigbee, but they basically took a look at the market and said, the only way we're going to do this is through the operators, so we're not trying to compete with them. But secondly, we need to build a model that's more like the airline industry, which is like the Star Alliance, whereby you actually buy one ticket and you can fly on any airline and you have a seamless experience. The gates, you can share gates, you can share the luggage system, you pay once. And that wasn't the case with mobile network operators who all had a proprietary SIM. My SIM and my roaming agreements, and if they don't work, tough, but you're locked in. So what we did was we built, and we currently have 16 interconnects, 16 large global operators, and we have a virtualized switch in the cloud that is completely agnostic to the operators. And we can not only connect a device to any of those operators, but uniquely and critically, we can localize the connection onto any of those operators. So I'm not talking about roaming. Of course, we can do all the roaming. We can roam onto 800 networks. But what we can do is if it goes into a certain market, the switch can localize. The reason that's important is that what that then does is encourage collaboration between the operators, because the operators only get 20% of the revenue if they accept roaming, and they get 100% of the revenue if they accept localization. So their financial incentive is not to accept roaming. I've been in SI 6 years, and the price of a gigabyte of data has come down 10x in that time. So what people don't realize is the price of data is following Moore's law. So when the price of data comes down 10x over a 6-year period, and you're only getting 20% of the price of the data, you have a increasingly unattractive incentive to accept roaming. So the elephant in the room here is that you start to see the breaking of the worldwide roaming model, which works for consumer voice because you're only in the country 30 days and then you come out. It doesn't work when an IoT device is in there for 10 years. And you see it already in the market. You see people making announcement, no longer doing narrowband IoT. 2-3 years ago, if we were going to do a podcast, narrowband IoT is the savior of it. I mean, it's really cheap, and it's all going to be now. People saying, "Oh, I'm not doing that anymore." The reason they're not doing it anymore, they can't afford to do it anymore because you're getting 20% of a tiny number. So our model is federated localization through a switch, and what that is like the Star Alliance, and we fundamentally believe that the Star Alliance model is the way you have to solve this. So the business model or the architecture of the business model is the bit that people don't talk about, because roaming is breaking and roaming agreements get broken all the time. And that's the way we deliver. We win the Shells, we win the Coca-Colas, we could go on and on, but we have a lot of very large customers. And by the way, Ryan, we have some MNOs who are now saying, look, I want to be able to do this. You've got the federation, and I'll white label your solution so I can do it. So that's what we on the connectivity side, we think the Star Alliance model is key, and we can talk about the device side as well.
Yeah, so how much from a challenge or a problem perspective, how much of it is difficulty getting the right connectivity? How much is it the cost? And then I guess the integration into the device. Like which, I guess, how would you kind of rank those as the biggest?
Let's divide those into pieces. So the connectivity cost device. Connectivity, first of all, people want agnostic MNO connectivity. So they want connectivity from any operator. They don't really care. So, which is why people are buying from MVNOs. But secondly, with regard to the cost of the connectivity is not the issue. I mean, frankly, the cost of a megabyte is so cheap now. It's pretty trending to zero. The cost of a connectivity is really not an issue. The issue is the cost of the inefficiency of the fact that you have to have different product SKUs, which means that your manufacturing, your supply chain, your installation, your warranty, that's where your cost is. It's in the back end processes. So it's the hidden cost. If you just look at the cost of the data, you're looking at 1% of the project costs. 99% of the inefficiency is in the back end processes, which is why the big companies aren't doing global rollouts. But the second part, the third element was the device, and that's the second part of the solution. So, a little bit of history, if I may. When you get to my stage in your career, you can look back and say, I've seen a few things, right? So for 40 years ago, with the mobile network operators and cellular emerging, what happened is the switch was controlled by the operator. Every operator has their own switch, which means they choose their roaming agreements, right? And that's how the model works. We know that. Then what started happening about 10, 12 years ago is the switch moved up one level, and now the MVNOs say, well, listen, I'm not just operator A, I'm operator A, B, and I'll do the switch. So the switch rose up. The issue now is that when you have a federation and a federation approach, you have all these new standards: SGP02, the consumer standard, SGP32, the push rather than the pull model to get the IMSI into the device. The way the firmware works, when you connect with AT&T in the US versus when you then hop onto Verizon, you need different firmware settings. And there are hundreds of these edge cases, and the firmware needs to be optimized. So what does all that mean? What it actually means is this: in order to achieve 100% connectivity, the switch has to move again. Switch has to be resident in the device. Now, I want to use a quick analogy here. When iPhones first came out, 2007, Steve Jobs' famous speech, the Flint Center in Cupertino, launched the iPhone. What then happens is companies like Twilio then said, oh, all these app developers are developing millions of apps, but they don't know how to put omni-channel communication in the apps. But don't worry about that. Here's a plug-in from Twilio. Plug these APIs in, and you can get video, voice, SMS, social media, etc., etc. And people said, I don't know how to program that. I'll use Twilio. There isn't a Twilio for IoT. Because when people are developing devices, IoT devices, they don't know how to do agnostic connectivity, EUICC, eSIM connectivity across a federation of operators. Because that's what you need to do. You need to have your device agnostic to the underlying architectures of all these different operators. So the second thing that we do is that we have essentially a device resident switch. Sits in the firmware like a Twilio. It sits in the firmware and it analyzes like the network state. The device chooses the network operator. The device is where the switch is, like a client server model back in the day. You've got the device software and you've got the cloud software, the RSP, remote sim provisioning software, and the orchestration and the switching is done between the device and the cloud. To net it out, what we believe, and again, this is in our predictions report we do every year, is that in order to implement edge computing in 5G, the intelligence will move to the edge, but the switch will move to the edge. And by having the intelligence in the device as a plug-in, you then will be able to have multi-RAT agnostic connectivity across a federation of all operators, not just do cellular, but also do Wi-Fi, LoRa, satellite, etc. So the architecture model to deliver 100% connectivity for IoT isn't just about how many roaming agreements you've got, or in fact you've got an eSIM. We believe you have to have a federation, and we believe you have to have device software expertise, because the switch is going to move to the device.
Now we're kind of in the device side, and you mentioned firmware as being one of the big challenges for the devices. Is there anything else in kind of that section, or I guess area of IoT on the device side. We talked about connectivity, now device, and I also want to talk about security too.
Yeah, so again, in our survey, the third issue that people identified, I talked about the connectivity and I talked about the device. And the third one is that a big increase in the last 12 months on security being an issue. We always wondered for a few years why security was relatively low. It's important in other areas, but in IoT, it was talked about, but it never came out of the surveys. When you ask people the question, well, why did you fail? You actually start to get a better view on the numbers. So the issue on security, it's a big subject, but if I just try and net it out really brief, is that this is to do with a trust model. The problem is when you have the device and the device goes through various nodes and layers and then eventually gets to the center, that data can be intercepted. So you can't, although you can make the device secure, you can't trust whether or not it's been intercepted and by the time it gets into your cloud. And so what you really need to be able to implement is a security model that is actually horizontal across all the paths for IoT and not just a security model for the device or a security model for the application at the back end. And that's a bit like a blockchain type model where you can actually have trust in the provenance of the data and the fact that the data hasn't been touched. So think of it as like public-private key encryption in the device and where the data gets received. I can show, like blockchain will be able to do, I can show that this data has not been intercepted. If you can, and changed in any way, if you can trust the data, then what you can then do is actually have a security model that allows you to monetize new things. And an example, let me just use one of the first examples we've seen is people doing carbon credits. You can have a carbon credit for a device that's using solar rather than electricity, but people say, yeah, but I don't believe the data. You can hack the data. If you can trust, because the data is not just encrypted, but it's public. There's an application in the device that does the public-private key algorithm that's consistent with the application in the server. Then what you can say is, no, my data is real and it's higher quality than other people's data. And carbon credits are traded on an exchange where the price value is varies like a stock exchange based on the quality and the trust you have in the data. So what we believe, and it's in our predictions report, and what we're seeing is that we're now seeing a merging of security and trust, where the data is actually encrypted, not just in the pipes, but in the device itself. And all of these things point to device resident software, intelligent software in the device. And so when you mention firmware, customers don't have firmware engineers. They cost about $200,000 a year base salary. They don't have them. They don't want them. We wave goodbye to that with cloud. So what you need is plug-in applications that do the IoT communications for you, as well as the security, the IPsec, the security side.
So let me ask you, you kind of alluded to some predictions, thinking about my stuff obviously going forward. After doing this report, how have you all reflected on it and started to think about next year, going to 2025? What's going to happen? Where are we going? As you already mentioned at the beginning, predictions have been something that have been very difficult. They've been optimistic. We haven't really hit them as an industry, but realistically speaking, and given your best guess, where are we going in 2025 and what should we be expecting?
I'm going to now contradict what I said at the beginning, because what I'm going to say is, and I realize I'm being recorded, right? What I'm going to say is, but this year I do believe things are different. Okay. But let me tell you why I do believe. I don't think they're going to be radically different, but I do believe we will see a jump up. The reason is that there's nothing I've said on this podcast that the industry doesn't know. I mean, you go to Mobile World Congress or you go to all these events and everyone's talking about the problems of roaming. Everyone's talking about the need for device intelligence. People are saying that the IoT projects haven't given them the ROI. So I actually believe that the industry has now started to do what other industries did previously. We with open source software, with the IP, I used to be at Cisco with the IP standard, we enabled interoperability around a common standard. And at that point, you saw the inflection of adoption. That's always the case in IT. What's happened now, if we look forward, there's things like EUICC standard, which is now out there, GSMA. You have the SGP02 standard, which has been around for a while, and the SGP22. We had the division between enterprise and consumer, but now the SGP02 standard is going into the SGP32. It's not fully ratified yet, but it's pretty close. So you have that standard side, and then you have the eSIM, which is replacing the plastic SIM, because you need a SIM that's more like a computer than a plastic SIM. So if you just take those three industry developments, which may seem like acronyms that people don't need to be aware of, the combination of those two is enabling interoperability at different levels of the stack. And as I said, in my experience, going back many years, whenever all technology starts off as proprietary, until user demand and frustration insists that standards are enabled for interoperability. There's tons of examples: mainframes, mini computers, PCs, et cetera, et cetera. My first mobile phone, I could only call you if you had Vodafone, but if you had another network, I couldn't call you. Now, my kids think that's hilarious. Now, what's happening with IoT is that we are starting to see interoperability and agnosticity enabled by a set of standards promoted by the standards bodies. Finally, as that is now happening, you are now seeing an increasing number of RFPs being issued by large companies. Two things happening. Large companies saying, now I'm going to do my global project because I don't have to put a different SIM in the device in every country. That's where the ROI is. The second thing you're seeing, which is this year's prediction, is the large MNOs are saying, you know what? I know for years and years and years, I said I'd always go to market with just my SIM. But guess what? I won't stay alive if I do that, because my customers are demanding global solutions, and my roaming agreements won't do it because I can't do it because of the economic problems of roaming. So actually what you're now seeing is an increasing adoption by MNOs of white label solutions for them to be able to do this, but still control the customer, still do all the billing. So we think two things are going to happen: increasing number of large companies doing big global projects. So we finally get towards the vision of what we said, because that's where the money is. And secondly, an increasing number of MNOs saying, I'm going to put a package, a solution on top of my Cisco Jasper platform or my legacy Ericsson platform or whatever it is. I'm going to put an eSIM a platform solution on top of that, so that I can actually sell this through my brand, through my sales force. I control the customers. And yes, I'm selling my competitors' data, if you like, but I will be agnostic and not proprietary. So the Hotel California, check out anytime you like, but you can't leave model, I believe, will break this year. But the danger is you're going to want me to do another podcast in a year's time and see whether that really happened. And I think it will.
I think we will, yeah. So you mentioned standards. We've actually talked to other people from your company. We did a webinar with you all around the SGP 32 standard that's coming out. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that kind of plays into what you've already been kind of mentioning?
Many of your viewers will had good and bad experiences with SGP 32. Let me first say that SGP 32 is going to be the future. Great. It is the way in which the SIM, the IMSI, International Mobile Subscriber Identity, can be pulled by the device down from the cloud without it having to be pushed. So it's the way the Kindle works. It's the way your iPhone works. Having said that, one of the things that happened when the SGP 32 standard was announced, a whole bunch of companies, no names, a whole bunch of companies suddenly produced a very slick demo and said, "Oh," and they went to shows, and you could go and see, show me your demo. Press a button. Oh, you're on operator A. Look, watch this. Press a button. You're on operator B. Press a button. You're on operator C. And people said, "This is marvelous. This is freedom. This is agnostic connectivity." What they didn't show is, think of it like an iceberg. What they didn't show is what was under the water, because the customer who was going to agree the contracts and the pricing with each of the operators. I was talking to one of the leading industry analysts the other day, and he said, yeah, and we found a new one out the other day, which is when you go from operator A to operator B, there's nothing in the industry standard that automatically tells operator A you're no longer connected to them. So it doesn't leave a forwarding note and then say cancel the connection. So what actually happens is some people are using the early versions of SGP32 solutions, and actually they find that they've actually ended up paying twice because the original operator still thinks they're connected. In other words, there's a lot under the waterline that has to be managed as a managed service in order for SGP32 to release its potential. Our view, and we have some automotive customers who are doing exactly this, our view is what's actually needed is you actually need the ability to choose between push versus pull. It's just another way of getting the IMSI into the device. But you need a managed service where the managed service provider says all those issues, like how do you change the APN? If you go from operator A to operator B might use a different APN. Who's going to do that for you? I didn't think about that. Well, you need to think about that because it won't work. So don't be fooled by the demo. But what we say is look for and again, we've a white paper on this and a podcast on our website that we've released on this goes into a lot of detail from an analyst called Matt Hatton, who is a leading expert in this field. But his prediction is that SGP32 will be delivered by managed services providers. It won't be done by large enterprises with their own connectivity departments, and it won't just be done by pure MNOs with a proprietary solution, but it will be done but through a managed services solution because of the complexity of all the stuff below the waterline. It will be hugely important, and eventually a lot of these things will be automated. But we've seen some horror stories of people who've gone early and suddenly found that they were actually paying more for connectivity because they didn't know what they didn't know. It's the Donald Rumsfeld unknown unknowns problem. So I would just say caveat emptor, buyer beware. Look for a managed service provider who's got experience in doing both and actually knows how to provide you with a managed service so you don't have to get into the guts of this standard and all these details, which we talk about between those of us who are in IoT, but most customers say, I don't want to enter this rat's nest of complexity. But it is the most important breakthrough in standards going because that is the way you enable true global agnostic connectivity. And that with the EUICC standard and the eSIM, I think is going to be as significant as the IP standard was in routing, as open source standards were, as the ability to phone somebody on a different network to the SIM card in your phone. I think that is what we will see increasingly adopted going forward. And that's good for everybody, and especially for customers.
Last thing I want to ask you before we wrap up here is about a topic I think is very exciting to talk about, which is kind of use cases that we're seeing IoT being used in. The general growth of the industry as we've seen more solutions developed, more companies find success with IoT deployments, I think contributes to the overall growth in probably one of the most impactful ways. So from your report and all the work that you're all doing, what are the new use cases that you're seeing your customers kind of get involved in, or do you have any that you're really optimistic about that will really lead the way next year?
I'll give you two real quick ones. A big enterprise company and then an emerging markets use case. The big enterprise company, I've mentioned them already, Amazon. I did a podcast with the IoT project manager at Amazon. I believe we're the only vendor they've ever done a podcast with. That's what they said. So that was pretty cool. Amazon, there's something called Amazon Key well, it's a global project, but it started in North America. Basically, it's the ability for the Amazon Prime driver to deliver your package. There's an option that goes to your garage door, but this is the one that lets, if you live in a condominium complex, they can actually get into the condominium complex with secure access and video because they only have 84% first-time delivery success, and this raises it to 93. Huge project for Amazon. They do 40, 50 billion packages a year. If you raise your first-time delivery success across that sort of number, you can imagine what the ROI is. What they want to do is make that an industry standard because you don't just get packages from Amazon. You get them from UPS, DHL, FedEx. Boil it down, they want to own access to every door in the world. This is Typical Amazon, low ambition project. They use our technology for that. And what they do is very interesting, what's called long tail mass personalization, which is the optimization of the connectivity on a door by door basis based on advanced algorithms. So the switch being device resident needs to be able to look at the network state. What is the latency? Yes, I've got a connection, but what's the latency of that connection? They want to move into that area where they're optimizing the connection. The guy said, they're now at the zip code level, but they ultimately want to move to the individual door level. So this is a really good example of what I call long tail personalization. So it's a segment of one personalization of connectivity based on algorithmic analysis. And obviously AI will play a huge role in that because of all the different parameters that determines good connectivity. It's not just 5 bars on the SIM card. The second one I would say, and I've done a podcast on this one as well, is a company called eWater. They are delivering water to remote villages across Africa. And this one is in places like Kenya. Most water is actually fetched from wells or reservoirs because there's no taps. And he talked about 12-year-old girls stop their education at 12 because their job becomes to go fetch the water 3 times a day. And they're carrying 40 kilograms of water. Now, 40 kilograms of water is just under 100 pounds. Imagine a 12-year-old girl walking through the bush in the heat several times a day carrying 100 pounds of water. That is life for them. And they can't do education and whatever. Anyway, this company has works with us because we provide 100% connectivity in Africa. And basically, it's a model to, there's plenty of water pumps, but they're all broken. They basically are enabling an economic model for maintenance, which means that there is a financial incentive for people to fix the taps that are broken. So lots of charities putting taps into these villages. The taps get broken, no one has a financial incentive to come out and fix the tap. So without going into too much, it's a really cool project. It's actually a bit of a tearjerker, actually. But they've been going 4 or 5 years now, and now they're getting the first cohort of girls who are now going to college because they were able to do their education rather than go fetch the water. It's not just the big companies and the corporates. IoT, your podcast called it, IoT for all. IoT also has enormous opportunities to change people's lives in emerging markets. And sometimes it's stories like that latter one that keep us all motivated to keep working on this industry because that is really making a difference.
We actually had a conversation the other day about IoT for good, just kind of what that means, as an initiative that I think, we have this physical world that we haven't been able to do a lot with from collecting data and better being able to automate things. And that's what IoT is able to really help do, not just in the corporate business sense, but also just in the general world, right? And I think that's something that shedding light on is very important.
I don't think people do shine a light on these case studies because they automatically say, give me the name of the megacorp that's doing something. Some of the interesting stuff that's happening, like carbon credits, which is very much an emerging market thing, and provision of water, provision of light, letting people do their homework after it gets dark. How do you get a financial model for running everyone in Africa has a phone. Penetration of mobile phones in Africa is like 2-3 times what it is in the UK and the US. Everybody has a phone, and they pay for everything with their phone. It's Google Pay is the normal way. In many ways, they're kind of advanced because everyone is connected. And the networks are pretty good. There's just a lot of them. So what you have to do is connect them together. But once you do that, you can actually leapfrog a lot of stuff. And we have a lot of business in Africa. In fact, we do all the IoT for MTN, the African provider. They white label our solution. 18 countries MTN uses for. But there are a lot of really, really cool IoT projects in emerging markets. And I do believe we should shine a light on it because it's important and people can identify with those case studies more than some obscure corporate case study.
Well, Nick, this has been fantastic. A true pleasure to kind of catch up and not just learn about what you're doing, but just kind of what you've spent the time and money and resources on to better understand, analyze what's happening in the industry to help move things forward. And so it's a very exciting time, I think, for the industry as a whole. For our audience who wants to learn more about what you have going on, obviously check out the report we're already talking about here, follow up with any questions, what's the best way they can do that?
So the company's SI, no one can ever spell it, so I'll do it again. Eseye. Don't ask why. Founders thought it was a good idea. If you go to si.com and you look at any of our resources there, you can see the predictions report. You can see the state of adoption report. There's lots of menus that pop up everywhere you move. You get a menu which says if you want to reach out, there's a way of getting in touch with us. Everything that I've talked about actually is publicly available on the site. I do my own podcast series. It's called IoT Leaders. We've done just under 50 podcasts. And so the Amazon podcast is on there. The eWater podcast is on there and a bunch of others. So but first protocol, si.com.
Well, Nick, thank you again for doing this. And I'm sure we'll have you back sometime next year where we can kind of talk about some of these predictions we talked about here.
Hold me to account.
Yeah, we'll hold to see which ones came true and maybe some new ones that come up.
All right. Good to see you again, Ryan. Take care.